I'm delighted today to have as our guest Gregory Copley, who's the founder and head of the prestigious intelligence and geopolitical consultancy, the International Strategic Studies Association, based in Washington, and a most prodigious author. And the subject today is AUKUS. You've described that, Greg, and welcome.
Good to be with you.
Good, thank you. You've described that as the most significant alliance since the end of the Second, well, not the end of the Second World War, but since the end of the Cold War. And you talk about the two pillars, and you have different views on the two pillars of AUKUS. But I think saying that it's the most significant alliance since the end of the Cold War does emphasize the importance of this alliance.
It may well be the most important alliance since the end of World War II, in fact. Not that the NATO pact was not enormously significant in confronting the Warsaw Treaty Organization, but the reality is that for the first time, AUKUS has created an alliance which has an integrated military capability of three significant military powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and finally Australia. And between them, they cover every ocean in the world, the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, the two polar regions and the like. So this is quite unique. And that gives an unparalleled global power projection or defensive capability. Now, the question is whether the three governments involved recognize the potential for this. I know they're talking about adding Japan into the mix as well, and possibly even at some stage, even New Zealand or Canada, and Canada perhaps, but that's down the path. But in the meantime, there's this enormous potential with AUKUS, which is not tied to a specific adversary. Of course, a lot of the speculation is that it's tied to defeating the People's Republic of China and the threat from the People's Republic of China. But that's not entirely true. AUKUS, and particularly what they're now calling Pillar 1 of the AUKUS Accords, was to transfer nuclear attack submarine propulsion capability and technology to Australia so that Australia could build nuclear attack submarines, SSNs. What's likely to happen, however, is we will not see the fruits of that endeavor until perhaps 2035 at the earliest, and with a real operational capability into the 2040s and 2050s. By that stage, the People's Republic of China will have either become a very real threat and have launched a major conflict with the West, or it will have evaporated because of its economic implosion. And that economic implosion is underway right now. So the grounds or the premise for starting AUKUS, namely the transfer of nuclear propulsion technology to Australia, is not really a valid argument in terms of defeating the People's Republic of China threat. What we have to look for is the threat which emerges, or the strategic balance or imbalance which emerges after the China threat has disappeared. And that's likely to include countries such as India, a greatly revived Russian Federation, which is already on the march there and into the Indian Ocean and Pacific, with quite some ingenious strategies and strengths, and we mustn't overlook that. But the reality is that the pressure to build SSNs in Australia and to acquire leased or purchased SSNs from the US and the UK is very problematic. This is where I have some problem with the way the alliance is progressing under Pillar 1. We're looking at spending what could be close in the end to an operational through life cost of $1 trillion, going into a future where we don't understand the threat and we don't understand where technology may be at that time. Now, I'm sure that nuclear-propelled submarines are going to be invaluable to navies for the foreseeable future, perhaps through the end of this century. But the reality is that there are also new technologies emerging, and Australia is also at the forefront of that technology, which is long-range, large, underwater, unmanned submarines. In other words, a strategic strike capability with unmanned submarines that can be controlled by surface warships or even back from Canberra or from an Australian command facility. And we're also looking at a world which will have many more unmanned and very, very capable aircraft systems. So we're looking at a range of artificial intelligence, jet-powered and assisted machines, which are going to go into this strategic framework within 10, 15 years. So the question is, are we going to distort Australia's defence budget for the next 30 or 40 years on an uncertain bet? There's no question we need submarines. Do we need this big SSN capability? Buying 3 or so used US Navy Virginia-class submarines and then getting a couple of new ones from the US after that, and then buying as many as 5 or 8 astute, post-astute class AUKUS submarines, some of which would be built in the UK and some of which would be built in Australia. So what we could see within 15, 20 years, again, when we don't know what the strategic environment is or the economy, we'll be trying in the Royal Australian Navy to man 3 different types of submarines: the Collins class, the Virginia class, and the AUKUS class submarines. This is an unsustainable approach, given that there are very different technologies on all 3 classes of submarines, different training and manpower requirements, different supply chain requirements, and the like. So this is going to distort Australian defence thinking, and it hasn't been thought through, just as we didn't think through the whole submarine replacement program when replacement for the Collins class was initially mooted. It's been a progressive series of disasters, and right now we need to start facing that and perhaps make some prudent decisions. I know that there's going to be a tendency to choose the Americans.
I think you're right, Greg. We haven't thought it through, just as they didn't think through even the acquisition of the Collins class, which got into all sorts of difficulties at the beginning. But there's another issue I'd like to ask your advice on. For the Americans and for the British, who don't have many of these and they're only slowly getting additional ones, will the fact that if they give or they sell one to Australia, one of these very scarce ones to Australia, even a used one and certainly a new one from the British, will the fact that when they come into Australian hands, they won't have nuclear weapons on them and therefore be less useful than the ones in the possession of the United States Navy and the Royal Navy, will that be a relevant factor?
I don't think so. Nuclear weapons are highly mythologized. Nuclear weapons are just nothing but big bombs. We keep thinking of them as Armageddon weapons, but they're not war-winning weapons. They didn't win the Second World War, and they are not likely to win any future major wars. They can certainly cause a great concentration of firepower, if you like, and destroy cities. And destroying cities is not what wins wars. And we saw that in the war against Germany. We saw it in the war against Japan during World War II. We have to bear in mind that Emperor Hirohito in Japan had already agreed to the surrender of Japan before the 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those bombs were dropped as much as anything else to give a warning to the Soviets, who were moving their troops down through Sakhalin Island, north of Japan, and down through the Kuril Islands, and were getting ready to make their own landing on the Japanese main islands. That would have been disastrous for Japan and for the Western Alliance. So the United States' move to send that signal was apropos. But the reality is that you cannot win a war by an escalation to nuclear weapons unless you have a target so small that you can destroy its entire capability with a series of nuclear weapons, missiles or air-delivered or artillery-delivered. And so that's not likely to happen. So the reality is that the Virginia-class SSNs and the Astute class presently in the UK mostly use conventional weapons. They use conventional torpedoes and tube-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles to strike at targets. Yes, you can put nuclear weapons on them, but the reality is that Australia needs submarines to stop the projection of foreign navies, namely the People's Republic of China's Navy at the moment, for example. That's what the Collins class are there for, and they have a unique capability to operate because of their technology in shallower waters than the nukes are comfortable with. So they can stop PLA Navy warships coming down through the ASEAN waterways and through the South China Sea. They're relatively less detectable than most submarines. So that's been a very good acquisition for us. And the ability to, with a nuclear-powered attack submarine, is to be able to operate for over long distances and for long periods, and where you can disrupt enemy shipping and launch selective attacks on land targets and the like. But the reality is not to emphasize the need for nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have had their day. They caused a great psychological impact, and they have done since the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks. But the wars of the future are being won before armed conflict gets underway. This new total war strategy where you weaponize all manner of society against your opponent so that you weaken their economies, weaken their resolve, break up their unity and the like. And we're seeing that as the primary weapon of warfare into the 21st century.
Greg, you were the first commentator I was aware of to warn that China had passed its zenith as an economic power and was in difficulties, and you're the first to, I think, give a realistic assessment of AUKUS. And what you're really saying is that Pillar 2, the fact of the treaty and the other advantages that we can get out of it, that finally is the real advantage, you think, of AUKUS.
Oh, there's no question about it. And what's been clear as Pillar 2 of AUKUS has begun is that the US and the UK have benefited enormously from the transfer of Australian intellectual property, which has been helpful to their defence programs. So Australia has a lot to offer in that regard. Australia is behind the curve, if you like, in having lost its cohesive defence industrial base or national security industrial base over the years. We had the capability to build aircraft from scratch and local designs. We had the capacity to build armoured vehicles, warships and the like, and we lost a lot of that. And we're scrambling to catch up, and yet successive governments, Labor and Liberal, have sold off Australia's defence industrial birthright, so that now we see companies like BAE from the UK, Thales from France, Lockheed Martin and Boeing and so on from the United States, literally controlling Australia's national security industrial base rather than the Australian investors and taxpayers. In the past, we developed an enormous capability. Companies such as BHP, before they became obsessed with just digging and selling minerals, were actually involved in vertical integration of industry and took a large stake in the development of the Australian aerospace industry, for example, where we saw Australians designing and building the fastest piston engine fighter in the world at the end of World War II, the fastest jet fighter for a while in the early jet era with the Avon Sabre fighter. We were the pioneers in jet-propelled unmanned aerial vehicles as well.
And on that point, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're running out of time. But this is really valuable information and a valuable reminder of our role as a manufacturing power. Once again, thank you very much for your contribution, because these are very important matters which aren't being brought out into the discussion of AUKUS in Australia, and ones which must be brought out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.